I'm leaving, Evelyn Scott declared, her voice slicing through the stillness of the room like a cold blade. She stood at the head of our Thanksgiving table, a wine glass held high, as though offering a toast to some unknown fate. I'm in love with my secretary. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The turkey on the table, once warm and inviting, grew cold, its golden skin now a dull mockery of the warmth that had just moments ago filled the room. Silence fell. A crushing, stifling silence that no one dared break. David, our son, froze, his fork suspended in midair, as though the weight of the words had stolen his ability to move. Katie, our daughter, stared down at her plate, her fingers tracing the rim of the cranberry sauce, avoiding the harsh reality unfolding before her. My sister Patricia's jaw literally dropped, her expression frozen in shock. Robert, her husband, found sudden interest in his napkin, as if it had become the most fascinating object in the room. She's 22, Scott continued, his voice dripping with a pride that felt like venom. And she's everything you're not, Evelyn. I set my silverware down with a soft clink, the sound too loud in the thick silence that enveloped us. My napkin came to my lips, but my hands felt mechanical, numb. I wiped my mouth slowly, the cool cloth a momentary distraction from the storm raging inside me. And then I turned my gaze on Scott, the man I had spent 25 years with, the man I thought I knew. Good timing, I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil that twisted inside me. I wasn't sure how I had found this calm, but I had. I was Evelyn Hargrove, 51 years old, a senior accountant at Westridge Financial for a quarter of a century. I had spent my days balancing spreadsheets, my nights balancing family life. I had built a life I believed was secure, a life with Scott, our children, and a modest home in the historic Heritage Hill neighborhood. What I wanted was simple. A future with the man I loved, to watch our children grow, build their own families, retire together, perhaps travel a little, finally breathe. And now, standing in the ruins of my marriage, that future lay in tatters before me. Scott's midlife crisis wasn't just some passing whim. It was an affair, one I had feared but never truly acknowledged. Jessica, the secretary he had hired 3 months ago, had become the object of his obsession. But it wasn't just the betrayal that twisted the knife, it was the humiliation. The deliberate public execution of our marriage, in front of our children, our guests, as though daring me to react, daring me to make a scene. We can discuss the details later, Scott said, lifting his wine glass higher, as if toasting to some grand new beginning. No one joined him. No one moved. Katie bolted from the room, tears streaming down her face. David remained rooted in place, his eyes burning with disgust and disbelief. I think you should leave, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but sharp, cutting through the tension.
It's still my house, too,
Scott replied, the smugness in his tone a calculated reminder that he had already planned his escape.
I'll pack some things tomorrow,
he said, dismissing me as if our lives were no more than a minor inconvenience. As our guests awkwardly excused themselves, Scott retreated to his study, leaving the rest of us to pick up the pieces of the wreckage he had left behind. With the remnants of the wine bottle still in my hand, I began mechanically clearing the dishes, my mind oddly calm. There was a strange stillness inside me, a numbness I couldn't quite explain. As I loaded the dishwasher, the blinking light on our answering machine caught my eye. I pressed play, the familiar voice of my Uncle Edward cutting through the silence.
Evelyn,
he began. It's James Benedict calling. I have some significant news regarding your uncle's estate. Please call me as soon as possible. Uncle Edward had passed away 3 weeks ago. My mother's brother, a lifelong bachelor who had made his fortune in commercial real estate. I had always been his favorite niece, but I hadn't expected much beyond a keepsake or small token from his will. But in that moment, as I stood alone in the wreckage of my marriage, I had no idea that Scott's dramatic exit would be overshadowed by an even more dramatic arrival. I had met Scott during our senior year at Michigan State. He had charmed me with his quick smile, his ambition, his effortless confidence. I was the diligent, organized one, already mapping out my future in accounting. We were an unlikely pair. His spontaneity softened my rigidity, my practicality grounded his dreams. At least that's the story we had always told ourselves. We married young, at 26, after I had already established myself in the local accounting firm, and Scott had launched his insurance agency. The early years were lean, but we were happy. We saved for a down payment on our Victorian fixer-upper in Heritage Hill, a home that consumed our weekends for nearly a decade. I took only 6 weeks of maternity leave with each child, returning to work while juggling the demands of motherhood. As Scott's business grew, so did his desires. The modest office expanded, and his wardrobe upgraded from department store suits to custom tailoring. He joined the country club, not for the golf, but for the connections that might lead to wealthier clients. I supported him, believing that these were investments in our shared future. My own career was steady, but unspectacular. I became known for my meticulous work and ethical standards, eventually earning my position as senior accountant at Westridge Financial. My salary helped keep us afloat during Scott's lean months, when his commission-based income faltered. Uncle Edward had always approved of my practical approach to life. "You're the aunt to all those grasshoppers," he would say during our monthly lunches. "Always preparing, always looking ahead." But even as I balanced our lives, something within me had begun to unravel. Scott's increasing criticism of my sensible clothing, his sudden interest in fitness at 49, the new convertible, purchased without a word, the late nights at the office, the faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. Classic signs of a midlife crisis, signs I had chosen to dismiss. But now, as I stood in the ruins of everything I thought I knew, the truth could no longer be ignored. I told myself that our foundation was too solid to crumble under the weight of such tired cliches. "Men go through phases," my sister Patricia had assured me when I confided my concerns. "Edward went through something similar at 50. Remember the motorcycle?" And so, I waited. I convinced myself that 25 years of marriage had earned me patience, earned me understanding. Even when Scott spoke of hiring Jessica, bright, intuitive, despite her lack of experience, I suppressed my unease. She was younger than our daughter, after all. Surely Scott wouldn't be so predictable. But 2 weeks ago, my doubt had finally been confirmed. I stopped by his office unexpectedly, bringing lunch as a surprise. The receptionist's pitying glance should have prepared me for what came next. A locked door, muffled giggles from inside, hushed voices that shouldn't have been there. I left the sandwiches with the receptionist, my heart heavy with the weight of an undeniable truth. I drove back to work, telling myself there must be a reasonable explanation. I chose trust over suspicion, loyalty over evidence. Now, as Scott refilled his wine glass, sitting alone in his own little world of solitary celebration, I wondered, had I been loyal to a man who had never truly existed? The morning after Thanksgiving broke with a crystalline clarity that only Michigan in November can provide. I had slept fitfully on the living room sofa, unwilling to share the bedroom with Scott. I heard him stumble upstairs well past midnight, the empty wine bottle abandoned, a silent witness to his betrayal. I made coffee and called James Benedict's office, leaving a message with his secretary still in yesterday's clothes. I needed something to focus on, something concrete, anything but the looming wreckage of my life. As I walked upstairs to change, I found Scott already awake, stuffing clothes into a suitcase. Jessica's apartment is too small for both of us, he explained, as if this was merely a logistical inconvenience. I'll stay at the Parkview Hotel until we find something suitable. The casual use of the word we stung more than I expected. When did it start? I asked, my voice shockingly calm given the storm churning inside me. Scott hesitated, his eyes flickering with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, surprise, or perhaps just the arrogance of someone who felt entitled to this escape. Does it matter? He shot back, his words sharp, defensive. 25 years of marriage deserves at least honesty about its end. He sat heavily on the bed we'd shared for decades, the weight of the moment making the room feel impossibly small. He sighed, like he was weighing the effort of recounting this twisted story. July, at the company picnic. She was interested, attentive. His voice hardened, as if accusing me of being the one who had failed to see. Do you know how long it's been since you were genuinely interested in anything about me, Evelyn? Jessica listens. She's excited about my ideas. She's 22. I gave him a flat look. Everything is exciting at 22. It's not just her age, Scott insisted, growing defensive. She sees me, the real me, the me that got buried under mortgages, college funds, life insurance policies. His words hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and evasive. I studied him, this man who had shared my life for a quarter of a century. The thinning hair, the dye that had begun to creep through the graying roots, the expensive watch that replaced the one I'd given him on our 10th anniversary, the designer clothes that strained at the edges of his middle-aged gut. Who was this man who could so easily discard the history we had built? Maybe what hurts most, I said carefully, is that you didn't respect me enough to end things privately. Scott's face flickered with something almost like shame, then his expression hardened. I needed witnesses, he said, his voice icy. Your family needs to understand this isn't just some fling or midlife crisis. They'll talk you through it. This is real. It was then that I understood. The calculated cruelty of his public declaration was no accident. He hadn't just wanted to break me. He had wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to make reconciliation impossible, to shift the blame entirely onto his shoulders so I wouldn't even try to fight for us. I see, I said simply, the words heavy with finality. Before I could say anything more, the doorbell rang, a sharp interruption to the tension that had gripped the room. Downstairs, I found a courier waiting with a certified letter that required my signature. The return address was James Benedict's law firm. I took the letter into the kitchen, tearing it open with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from something else, something I couldn't yet name. The formal language blurred as I scanned it, but then the key phrases jumped from the page. Sole beneficiary, controlling interest, comprehensive portfolio. And then, the number. The one that made my heart stutter in my chest. $4.7 million. Uncle Edward, who had lived so modestly despite his wealth, had left me his entire estate. The commercial properties, the investments, even his charitable foundation. The inheritance was structured as separate property, established after my marriage, and explicitly designated as belonging to me alone, not part of the marital estate. There was also a handwritten note from Uncle Edward. Evelyn, I've always admired your loyalty and strength. Life has a way of testing both. Consider this your safety net, whatever comes next. Somehow, he had known. Or perhaps he had suspected. Had he seen something in Scott that I hadn't? Or had my own concerns about him slipped into our conversations more than I realized? Upstairs, I could hear Scott on the phone, his voice animated, recounting his liberation to someone. Jessica. The name echoed in my mind, but it was no longer just the sting of betrayal. It was something else. Not quite anger, not quite relief, more like a quiet, unsettling clarity, a strange sense of possibility. The numbness I had been gripping onto for the past hours slowly gave way to something I hadn't expected to feel, a sharp, cutting focus. I folded the letter carefully, as if handling something both precious and dangerous. Placing it in my purse, I began forming a mental checklist of actions I needed to take. This wasn't how I had imagined my life unfolding at 51, but there it was. My Uncle Edward's final gift. A gift wrapped in a bitter irony. It wasn't just money. It was an unanticipated key to a freedom I hadn't known I'd needed. I waited until Scott had taken his suitcases and left, his departure punctuating the end of an era. Then, with a steady hand, I dialed James Benedict's number and confirmed the details of my inheritance. The attorney, who had been a contemporary of Uncle Edward's, suggested we meet immediately to discuss the next steps. He spoke with a matter-of-fact tone, his words almost clinical.
Your uncle was very explicit about his wishes,
James explained, his voice smooth and calculated. He wanted you to have complete freedom to make your own decisions, both personally and professionally. We scheduled an appointment for Monday morning. I hung up, feeling a strange calm wash over me. Within half an hour, Patricia was at my door, a bottle of wine in hand and a fierce, protective energy radiating from her. She stormed into the kitchen, her voice laced with fury. "That absolute bastard!" she seethed, pacing the room. "After everything you've done for him, the sacrifices, the support, it's over." I didn't need her anger. I needed clarity. I interrupted her, pouring us each a glass of wine, the liquid filling the glass in a slow, deliberate motion. "What matters now," I said softly, "is moving forward with dignity." Patricia paused, mid-step. She turned to face me, confusion flickering in her eyes. "You seem surprisingly calm." I slid Uncle Edward's letter across the counter. Patricia's gaze dropped to the page, her eyes widening as she read. The anger in her face quickly turned to astonishment, her mouth falling open in disbelief. "Holy shit, Evelyn, you're rich." "It appears so," I said, my voice steady, though the enormity of it all hadn't quite hit me yet. Patricia's grin turned predatory, and I couldn't help but feel a shiver of something darker creeping up my spine. "This is too perfect, Mr.
Midlife crisis thinks he's trading up for a younger model, not realizing his reliable old wife just hit the jackpot.
I couldn't help but nod, the flicker of satisfaction taking root deep within me. "He doesn't know yet," I said, my voice tight. "And I'm not sure how or when to tell him." Patricia's face hardened with a quiet, vindictive satisfaction. "You don't owe him anything. He humiliated you in front of your entire family. Let him find out when it's too late." Part of me, the part that had been betrayed and bruised, wanted to agree with her completely. Let him burn. Let him pay for his public humiliation. But the other part of me, the part that had lived through the ebb and flow of 25 years, knew that an impulsive reaction wouldn't do justice to what I had lost. I needed time. Time to process both Scott's betrayal and my sudden wealth. Time to understand how this could all coexist. The days passed in a haze. The children came and went, offering their support and voicing their anger toward their father. Katie refused to speak to him when he called, her silence speaking louder than words. David, on the other hand, agreed to meet for coffee. But when he returned, he was seething with indignation.
He tried to justify it,
David reported, his voice tight with suppressed rage.
He said he deserved happiness after sacrificing his prime years for the family. As if you didn't sacrifice just as much, I muttered, the bitterness of that realization rising in my throat. By Monday morning, I had composed myself enough to meet with James Benedict. His office, nestled in a sleek downtown building, had an air of quiet confidence. When I arrived, he greeted me with the same warmth as before, but there was something in his eyes, a knowing, perceptive look, that made me feel both seen and scrutinized. "Your uncle spoke of you often," James said as we settled into his wood-paneled conference room. "He admired your steady character tremendously." For 2 hours, James outlined the full extent of my inheritance. 6 commercial properties in Grand Rapids and surrounding areas, a diverse investment portfolio, controlling interest in a property management company, and stewardship of a charitable foundation supporting educational initiatives. Edward had left me everything, and as the pieces of my new life fell into place, I realized it wasn't just about money. It was about independence, about reclaiming control of everything I had let slip through my fingers for so long. Edward believed strongly in financial independence, James explained, sliding a folder across the table to me. Particularly for women. He paused, watching me carefully. His mother, your grandmother, was left destitute after his father's death. He never forgot that vulnerability. I listened, the weight of his words settling deep inside me. This inheritance wasn't just about material wealth. It was a lifeline, one that had been explicitly structured to remain separate from marital assets. "This is your safety net," James added, his tone heavy with unspoken meaning. "Whatever comes next, Evelyn." Uncle Edward had seen something in me, or at least suspected what I might need. Had he known? Or had I simply revealed my doubts and fears in more ways than I had realized? As I sat there, the paper still warm between my fingers, I realized that this wasn't just an inheritance. It was a beginning, and Scott didn't even know it yet. A legal distinction that would become crucial in the weeks to come. I left James's office, clutching a stack of documents, my inheritance now solidified in black and white. My phone chimed, pulling me from my thoughts. A text from Scott. "Need to discuss finances. Dinner tonight?" I didn't hesitate. I agreed to meet at a neutral location, a quiet Italian restaurant downtown where we'd once celebrated anniversaries. In happier times, the kind that now felt like a different lifetime, Scott arrived with his usual blend of smugness and unease. He kissed my cheek, a gesture that felt like a hollow mockery of what we had once shared. "You're looking well," he said, his eyes scanning me with slight confusion, as though expecting some physical sign of my devastation. Perhaps he imagined red eyes and a disheveled appearance, visible evidence of the wreckage he'd left in his wake. I bypassed the small talk. "What did you want to discuss?" My voice was steady, but underneath it, something else simmered. Scott cleared his throat, fidgeting slightly. "I've been thinking about the house. It makes sense for you to stay there, of course, but given its value, we should discuss compensation." "Compensation?" I repeated, the word tasting like something foul in my mouth. "My share of the equity," he clarified, his tone dripping with entitlement. "I'm thinking we could arrange a buyout over time." The audacity was breathtaking. Not only was he leaving me for a woman half my age, but he also expected me to pay him while he built his new life, as if he were offering me a deal I should be grateful for. "I need time to think about it," I said carefully, holding on to the fragile control I had over my emotions. Scott nodded magnanimously, as though granting me a favor. "Of course. It's a lot to process, but Jessica and I will need capital for our fresh start." Jessica. The name hung between us, a reminder of everything I had lost. What I understood, with chilling clarity,
was that Scott saw me as nothing more than a resource, a financial asset to be drained before being discarded, a stepping stone to his new life with Jessica. "I'll have my attorney contact you," I managed, my voice flat but steady, fighting to maintain my composure. Scott's eyebrows shot up, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You have an attorney already? That seems unnecessarily adversarial." He leaned back in his chair, a faint trace of concern in his eyes. "Evelyn," he continued, his tone shifting to one of false sincerity, "I thought we could handle this amicably." Amicable. The word hung in the air, bitter and hollow. Amicable. The same word he had used to describe the Thanksgiving dinner where he had humiliated me in front of our family. I repeated the word, tasting the bile it left in my throat. "Amicable," I echoed, the sting of the past still raw. Scott had the grace to look momentarily uncomfortable, but he quickly recovered, his voice taking on a more defensive edge. "I admit, the timing was, perhaps insensitive, but I needed to make a clean break." "For Jessica's benefit, you mean?" I couldn't help the sharpness that crept into my voice. He glanced at his watch, a nervous habit I had come to recognize from countless budget discussions over the years. "Jessica deserves a fresh start, without shadows from my past," Scott said, his voice soft but the underlying message clear. "She's young. She's got her whole life ahead of her, and I'm not—" The words sliced through the air, sharper than I had expected. "That's not what I meant," Scott quickly added, reaching across the table in an attempt to take my hand. I withdrew it smoothly, my eyes cold. "You'll be fine, Evelyn," he said, his tone patronizing. "You've always been resilient." Resilient. The word hung in the air, a subtle acknowledgement of how often I had bent without breaking throughout our marriage. The financial strains when his business was struggling, the years of balancing childcare with a full-time career, the endless emotional labor of maintaining the illusion of a perfect family. Always adapting, always accommodating. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, but something beneath it shifted. "Finally, I am resilient." Scott's expression faltered, the smug confidence draining from his face. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if sensing something had changed. "We should discuss the practical matters," he said, pivoting quickly. "Division of assets, support considerations. I've been looking at our financials." I interrupted, my voice cutting through his rehearsed speech. "There are some irregularities I'd like to address." Scott blinked rapidly, his composure cracking for a moment. "Irregularities?" "Withdrawals from our joint savings," I said, leaning in, watching him closely. "Approximately $47,000 over the past 6 months." His face flushed. "Business expenses," he muttered quickly. "Temporary cash flow issues." "And yet, your agency's profits have been declining for 3 years. I countered, my eyes fixed on him. The flash of alarm in his eyes confirmed what I had suspected for months. Scott had been siphoning our savings, using the money to fund his affair. Expensive dinners, hotel rooms, gifts for Jessica, the building blocks of his new life. "How would you know about the agency's profits?" Scott demanded, his tone defensive, his hands trembling slightly. "I'm an accountant, Scott," I said, my voice low and calm. "I notice patterns." He recovered quickly, smoothing his features into what I recognized as his client-facing smile, the one he wore when he was trying to charm his way out of trouble. "This is exactly why we need to approach our separation logically," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "We're both under stress. Making accusations won't help." "It's not an accusation if it's demonstrably true," I said, my eyes cold as ice. The words hit the table like a hammer, and for a moment the room seemed to grow colder. The truth, stark and undeniable, was no longer something he could hide behind his smooth words. It was out there, hanging between us, and there was no way to take it back, no matter how hard he tried. I slid my phone across the table, the screen displaying our bank statement with the withdrawals clearly marked. The evidence was irrefutable.
These withdrawals align perfectly with your late nights at the office and weekend client meetings, I said calmly, watching Scott's reaction. He stared at the screen for a long moment before meeting my gaze with cold calculation. Fine, he finally muttered, his tone laced with disdain. I've been planning my exit. Can you blame me? 25 years with the same predictable, boring routine, the same predictable, boring wife. The cruelty of his words cut through the air, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound. He wanted me to retreat into hurt, to let the sting of his dismissal overshadow the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. It might have worked a week earlier, but now I was past it. I'd like the money returned, I said, my voice unwavering. All of it. Scott laughed, the sound dismissive, a sharp bark that echoed in the quiet restaurant. That's not happening. Consider it the price of your freedom. Freedom? I echoed, leaning in, my voice low and cutting. Freedom isn't what you're selling, Scott. It's betrayal, packaged as liberation. His expression hardened, his face closing off as he shifted in his seat. You've always been judgmental, he spat, his voice tight with frustration. Jessica accepts me as I am. Jessica doesn't know who you are, I replied, my tone sharper now, the truth slipping free before I could stop it. But she will. Something in my voice must have registered, because for the first time, genuine concern flickered across his features. What does that mean? He asked, his voice laced with a nervous edge. But before I could respond, Scott's phone chimed with an incoming call. The name Jessica flashed on the screen. Take it, I encouraged, my lips curling into a tight smile. I'm sure she's eager to hear about your amicable divorce plans. Scott hesitated for a moment, the tension between us thick and palpable. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he stood and stepped away from the table to take the call, his voice dropping into a low murmur as he gestured animatedly, his back turned to me. I watched him, his figure stiff and practiced, undoubtedly reassuring his young lover that everything was proceeding as planned. The moment he was distracted, I signaled for the check. I waited, my mind replaying the events of the morning, mentally reviewing what I'd learned from James Benedict. Information I hadn't yet shared with Scott. The inheritance was just one part of the equation. The real bombshell was what Uncle Edward's private investigator had uncovered. 2 years ago, Scott had taken out a substantial business loan, using our house as collateral. Without my knowledge or consent, my forged signature on the documents constituted fraud. The loan was now in default, explaining his sudden urgency to discuss finances. Scott wasn't just leaving me for a younger woman. He was desperately trying to flee a financial disaster of his own making. In the 2 weeks following our dinner meeting, I executed a careful strategy on 3 fronts. First, I met with a forensic accountant, recommended by James Benedict, to document Scott's financial malfeasance. Second, I consulted with a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving fraud. Third, I took control of Uncle Edward's business interests, immersing myself in the details of commercial property management. Throughout this period, Scott continued his campaign to extract money from our marriage. His texts alternated between nostalgia. Remember our trip to Mackinac Island? We had something special, and thinly veiled threats. Jessica thinks I should get a forensic valuation of your accounting practice. I responded minimally, buying time while the evidence accumulated. The forensic accountant discovered more than I'd anticipated. Scott hadn't just defaulted on the fraudulent business loan. He had opened credit cards in my name, running up substantial debt. More damning still, he had been systematically falsifying his agency's financial records to conceal declining revenues. Potential insurance fraud. Maureen Winters, my divorce attorney, was blunt in her assessment. We have enough for criminal charges, not just divorce proceedings. The question is, what do you want? What I wanted was complicated. Justice, certainly. Protection of my assets, absolutely. But revenge? The emotion felt foreign, unproductive. What I needed was a fair resolution that acknowledged the reality of our situation. I want it concluded quickly, I told her, my voice low but steady. Maureen nodded approvingly. We'll file immediately, requesting temporary orders to protect your assets. The inheritance simplifies things. With your financial security assured, we can focus on untangling the fraud. The plan was proceeding smoothly until Scott surprised me by bringing Jessica to our house, my house, to collect some personal items. I arrived home from a meeting with Uncle Edward's property manager to find them in our bedroom. Scott was packing cufflinks and watches into a suitcase while Jessica lounged on the bed, scrolling through her phone as though she were in a hotel room, not in the home I had built for us. You must be Evelyn, Jessica said, her voice light and dismissive, not even looking up from her phone. Scott's told me so much about you. I studied her. She was pretty in the predictable ways, slim, blonde, with the effortless confidence of someone who hadn't yet encountered significant disappointment. She wore expensive clothes, the kind that still held the sheen of recent purchase. Scott's $47,000 walking and talking. Has he told you about the fraud investigation? I asked, my tone pleasant, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. Jessica's head snapped up. What? Scott emerged from the closet, his face flushed with anger. Evelyn, that's enough. I didn't flinch. Or the defaulted loan, the forged signatures, the credit card debt. She's lying, Scott cut in, but there was hesitation in his voice now. The confidence he had worn like armor was beginning to crack. Uncertainty seeped into his words, and I knew it then. He knew he was caught. Am I? I asked, my voice low, the words hanging between us like a challenge. I removed a folder from my bag and extended it toward Jessica. These are copies of the relevant documents. You might want to reconsider hitching your wagon to a sinking ship. Scott lunged for the folder, but Jessica was quicker. She grabbed it from my hand, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the contents, her growing alarm evident with each page. What is this? She demanded, holding up a credit card statement. Her eyes locked onto Scott's, confusion giving way to a realization. You said you were taking me to Paris after the divorce. You said you were financially secure. I can explain, Scott began, but Jessica was already moving toward the door, the folder clutched to her chest. She didn't look back as she fled, her voice carrying a bite of betrayal. You said Evelyn was the problem. As the door clicked shut behind her, Scott turned on me with a fury I had never seen before. Cold, calculated, and full of venom. You've ruined everything, he spat, the words sharp enough to cut. I looked at him, unfazed, and replied simply, You managed that entirely on your own. The next morning, Maureen called with unexpected news. Scott's contacted a different attorney. He's requesting an emergency settlement conference. He's desperate to settle quickly, she explained. Offering to admit to the fraudulent loan in exchange for not involving law enforcement. It seemed Jessica's departure had shattered Scott's illusions of a consequence-free fresh start. With his relationship crumbling and legal jeopardy closing in, he was finally facing reality. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt oddly hollow. 25 years of marriage, ending not with dignity, but with desperate negotiation to avoid criminal charges. What do you recommend? I asked Maureen, my voice steady despite the undercurrent of emotion swirling inside me. We're in a strong position, she replied, her voice confident. We could push for everything, the house, your full retirement accounts, even reparations for the fraud. The decision crystallized with surprising clarity. Schedule the conference, but I have specific terms in mind, I said, leaning forward. I want a clean break, complete separation, no further contact. Maureen paused, her eyebrows knitting together in surprise. No punitive measures? No restitution? I thought of Scott and Jessica in my bedroom, their casual invasion of the space where I had spent a quarter-century of my life. The way everything had been so quickly devalued, discarded. My fingers brushed the fraud documentation I had already prepared, safely stored in an escrow account. If he honors the divorce terms, it remains sealed, I said, my voice unwavering. If not, there will be consequences. Maureen's approval was clear in her voice. Exactly. The settlement conference was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, I had a property empire to learn. The day of the conference arrived, and I walked into Maureen's sleek downtown office overlooking the Grand River, my heart steady with purpose. Scott arrived alone, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain, a wrinkled shirt, shadows under his eyes, and the expensive watch that had once been a permanent fixture on his wrist, now conspicuously absent. His attorney, a nervous man with a permanent frown etched into his face, began with conciliatory language, trying to frame our issues as mutual mistakes, something that could be resolved with a simple, amicable agreement. Maureen's icy smile stopped him mid-sentence. Let's be clear about the situation, she said, sliding documents across the table. Fraud, identity theft, financial misrepresentation, these aren't mutual mistakes. Scott stared at the table, his gaze firmly fixed on the documents in front of him, avoiding my eyes. His attorney cleared his throat and began speaking, his words trailing off under the weight of Maureen's directness. My client is prepared to offer significant concessions, the attorney began, but Maureen wasn't swayed. That's fortunate, she replied smoothly. Because my client is prepared to file criminal charges. The threat hung in the air, sharp and heavy, like a blade poised to fall. Scott finally looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time during the meeting. His expression was a cocktail of resentment and fear. What do you want, Evelyn? He asked, his voice strained, like a man finally forced to face the consequences of his actions. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened the folder I had brought with me. Not legal documents, but photographs of our life together. Our wedding day, the births of our children, the house when we first purchased it, before renovations, the progression of a quarter-century of shared history. Memories Scott had chosen to throw away for a new life with Jessica. I want you to understand what you threw away, I said quietly, the words almost too soft for the weight they carried. Not just me, but your integrity, your children's respect, your professional reputation. The attorney interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the personal turn the meeting had taken. Is this necessary? He asked, his tone betraying his unease. The terms are simple, I continued, ignoring him. You sign over all rights to the house. You relinquish any claim to my inheritance or business interests. You agree to pay back the fraudulent loan and credit card debt. Scott's face reddened, his jaw tightening with fury. That's everything, he snarled. What am I supposed to live on? I slid a final document across the table, the weight of it heavy. The deed to a small commercial property on the outskirts of Grand Rapids, recently purchased with a portion of my inheritance. This building houses your insurance agency, I explained, my voice cool. The lease is paid for 5 years. It's your fresh start, Scott. More than you deserve, but less than you expected. The room fell silent as the magnitude of the moment settled in. Scott stared at the document, his face pale, and I knew he understood. The game had changed. He was no longer in control. His eyes widened, and I saw the moment of realization settle in like a heavy weight.
You own my building, he said, his voice faltering. I met his gaze evenly. Now I own a lot of things, I replied, my voice calm, unwavering. Sign the papers. 6 months had passed since that Thanksgiving, the day Scott's public declaration shattered our marriage. Now, I stood in the lobby of Hargrove Properties, watching workers install the new company signage. The commercial real estate firm I'd inherited from Uncle Edward now bore my name, a symbolic reclamation of my identity. Scott had signed the divorce papers that January afternoon, his hand trembling slightly as he accepted the terms. His attempt to craft a triumphant exit from our marriage had instead left him humbled and diminished. Jessica, having quickly calculated the diminished returns of a relationship with a man facing financial ruin, never returned. Our children had processed their father's betrayal in different ways. Katie maintained a cold distance, agreeing to occasional lunches but refusing to discuss anything personal. David, after his initial anger, had settled into a cautious, limited relationship with his father. Both had expressed quiet pride in how I'd handled the situation. You didn't let him destroy you, Katie observed during a recent dinner. That's what he wanted, wasn't it? To break you so he wouldn't have to feel guilty. Perhaps she was right. The public announcement, the casual cruelty, those had been designed to cast me as the discarded wife, a role that would justify his actions, both to our social circle and, most importantly, to himself. Instead, I had emerged stronger, wealthier, and remarkably whole. The accounting skills I had honed over my career now served me well. I had expanded Uncle Edward's property holdings, adding 3 buildings to the portfolio. In my first 6 months of ownership, Scott's insurance agency continued to operate in one of my buildings. It was our only point of connection, a monthly electronic rent payment, impersonal and transactional. I had heard through mutual acquaintances that Scott had ventured into online dating with limited success. Women his age found his history concerning. Younger women lost interest when they discovered his financial constraints. As the installation crew finished mounting the sign, my phone chimed with a calendar reminder: dinner with James Benedict to discuss the Educational Foundation's annual scholarship awards. This year, I had doubled the number of recipients, focusing on women pursuing financial and business education. Outside, spring had transformed Grand Rapids from its winter gray to vibrant green, a reflection of the growth and change within me. At 51, I was starting over, not with resignation, but with anticipation, curiosity, and a hard-earned wisdom about the difference between value and worth. The future stretched before me, unwritten and entirely my own.